Welcome back to the channel. I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist. In today's video, we are doing a deep dive of second-year wide receiver Jaxon Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Coming out of Ohio State and being majorly productive as a sophomore, big things were expected of him. Now, context is important here. He was in a crowded Seattle room, but as a first-round pick, big things are always expected of you. We're going to look at some advanced stats here. We're going to look at their depth chart, their offensive scheme, their new offensive scheme, delve into why things didn't work with former offensive coordinator Shane Waldron, what we might be able to expect of him in 2024, and what we can expect beyond 2024. Please remember to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. In a recent article, Seahawks expecting big things from wide receiver Jaxon Smith-Njigba in year 2. Smith-Njigba is quoted as saying, "Being on the outside, I feel like it's more of a one-on-one matchup, and I love one-on-one matchups," Smith-Njigba said. Being on the inside, there's some one-on-one matchups, a lot of zone, and just reading the defense and sitting in the zone, which I feel I'm pretty good at, but when it's one-on-one or being on the outside, it's more playground a little bit, and that's what I like. I like the challenge. So Smith-Njigba was primarily used in the slot this past season and with a very low ADOT. He's capable of winning on quick routes on the inside easily. He has 99th percentile agility. He's a fantastic slot receiver, and he's best used as a slot receiver, but his role was very limited, although when they allowed him to play outside, he excelled, which made it that much more confounding that they kept his ADOT so low and didn't allow him to succeed this past season. But the article continues, Smith-Njigba is just a hard cover, man, McDonald said, who's the Seattle Seahawks head coach. He can play outside, inside, and Grub does a great job of moving those guys around and finding some matchups. His lower body power and flexibility and being able to accelerate and obviously just having great hands and being able to track the ball is pretty impressive. So, new head coach of the Seattle Seahawks is Mike McDonald. He's a defensive head coach. He was the DC for the Ravens this past season. And they have a new offensive coordinator in former Washington Huskies offensive coordinator Ryan Grub. We're going to delve into his scheme a little bit later and what we can expect. But this is a completely new offense. The article continues, JSN's a great player and we're expecting big things out of him, McDonald said. He's had a great offseason, works his tail off, his practice habits are awesome, moving ability is pretty elite. I think we got a really cool plan for him. So, obviously, we haven't seen this yet. It's the first season of Ryan Grubb being an offensive coordinator in the NFL. So this could just be coach speak, but you're generally not going to disparage players that are working their tail off. But this is good to hear them explicitly say that they're going to plan to use him in creative ways and going to try to utilize him to his strengths. Standing at 6 foot 196, he is built more as a slot receiver. He's actually rather big for being only 6 feet tall. That does hamper his top-end speed, but it doesn't hamper his agility by any means. He's still only 22.4 years old, so he's definitely way before the age apex of age 26 for wide receivers. So there's plenty of time for him to improve as a receiver, and he was picked 20th overall this past season by the Seattle Seahawks. Looking at his metrics, he ran a 4.57 40-yard dash. Speed isn't his game. He is more of a shifty player than per se an overtly quick, fast player. His speed score is also in the 34th percentile, so not that impressive, but once again, that's not his game. His burst score is slightly above average in the 54th percentile, but look at that next stat. He has 99th percentile agility. This guy makes shifty cuts in and out of his breaks. He's one of the better route runners in the NFL, and it's improving. You'll see a quote later from Matt Harmon that will explain that. And his catch radius is actually above the 75th percentile, 76 to be specific. So what we have here in this profile is a slot receiver, although he can win outside. In fact, one of his touchdowns this past season was a game-winning touchdown, and it happened while he was outside running a fade route, and he made a nice over-the-shoulder adjustment to catch and corral the ball against the Eagles for a game-winning touchdown. So while he's best used in the slot, he can be used interchangeably, and especially at Z, because you'll get free releases off the line at Z just like you would as a Y wide receiver. Now, as far as contextualizing his rookie season, he was a first-round pick, drafted 20th overall to Seattle. They already had two established wide receivers in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, who are both very good players. And Geno Smith is a fine quarterback that's not going to create, but he can run an effective offense if the scheme isn't awful. But things did not go well for him at first. So once again, he went into a crowded situation. Then, as you can see, he broke his wrist in a preseason game. Well, that really slowed him down, first of all, in the preseason, didn't allow him to play, and then it got him off to a slow start at the beginning of his rookie year. And you want to get yourself going as quickly as possible to get acclimated to the NFL, and having a broken wrist as a wide receiver when you're trying to catch, it just might get in the way of that. He didn't top a 66% route rate in any of his first 3 games, but that's likely contextualized by the fact that he's a rookie and he had to earn his snaps, and the fact that he broke his wrist, so it made him less effective than if he had 2 fully functioning hands. Looking at his end-of-year stats, he was able to play in all 17 games. He did not even have 100 targets, though. He only had 93. Part of that is due to Shane Waldron's run-heavy scheme, as well as his love of using 2 tight ends, which partially is because they had issues with their tackles' health this past season. But they did not have the personnel for 12 personnel, at least to be a really effective offense. I think they were 17th in the NFL in offense. Very mid, by definition, of being 17th. But really did not take advantage of the personnel he was given. He seemed very rigid. You want to be able to work with your personnel. You don't want to make your personnel work to your scheme. That's not going to lead to success. He did have 63 receptions for 628 yards and 4 touchdowns, though, which isn't otherworldly by any means, but he was the wide receiver 3 on his team, on a run-heavy team, with Geno Smith at quarterback, who's fine but not amazing. But he did flash. That is important, and we'll get into that later, too. Alright, so he finished with 8.8 fantasy points per game, which was good for 56th in the NFL. I'm going to help contextualize that, and we're going to look into why we might be able to project not even just a little, but quite a bit of growth from him in 2024 and obviously in the future. So looking at Tyler Lockett versus Jaxon Smith-Njigba, because out of the trio of wide receivers in which the Seahawks have that are their starters, DK Metcalf is the clear X alpha in this offense. That's just not going to change. He's, I believe, the 6th most athletic wide receiver ever recorded in NFL history. And believe it or not, he is nowhere near his ceiling either, despite the wide receiver 20 through 27 points per game averages he's been having the last couple of seasons. I think this offense is really going to help him. But this is about Jaxon Smith-Njigba. So, like I was saying, he and Tyler Lockett are more similar. Tyler Lockett is a very, very good route runner, but he's not much of a yards after catch guy. He falls down almost immediately. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, however, he differs in that he excels at yards after catch. When we look at their stats side by side, it's clear that Tyler Lockett was the wide receiver too. His snap share tells you that. He generally had more targets in all but 5 games. I will say, though, if you look at the final 6 games, Jaxon Smith-Njigba had more targets in 3 of those 6 games, including an 11-target game against Dallas. That game was also, coincidentally, when DK Metcalf was not available for the Seahawks, so who stepped up in a big way? It was Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And he also had a touchdown overturned that would have added about 20 or so yards and obviously a touchdown to his stat line. and I do believe that was a touchdown catch. But what it showed is that when given the opportunity, he did step up. And when you look at some of their games side by side, he was much more efficient with his targets than Tyler Lockett was this past season. And that's not saying anything about Tyler Lockett's skill. He's very skilled. I do think, though, that he's declining, and we're going to get into that as well. It unfortunately does appear as though Tyler Lockett is declining. And here's a couple of stats that I think clearly show you that he is declining. So in 2022, he had an open score of 95, and that decreased to 70% in 2023. That has to do with obviously being able to get open separation metrics. So that is one indicator. Then when you look at his specific target separation from 2022 on the left to 2023 on the right, in 2022 he had 2.25 yards of target separation, which was good for 5th in the entire league. And this was also under Shane Waldron, so the exact same scheme. Then when we look in 2023, it decreased to 1.59, which was 58th in the NFL. That is a steep decline. We also look at his win rate versus man, because he was always one of the better man beaters in the NFL. Well, in 2022, he had a 46.3% win rate, which was also 5th in the entire NFL among wide receivers. Then this past season, it decreased to 35.9, which was good for 54th in the NFL. Both of those stats clearly show that he is declining as a player. He did, however, receive the second highest amount of targets in his entire NFL career, with 122 this past season. So it wasn't as though he wasn't still being targeted. He was still being targeted. He just wasn't getting as open and wasn't winning as much. In 2020, his points per game were the highest of his career, but as you'll see, each year it keeps declining. And this past year, it went from over 14 to about 11, and that is one of the steepest declines he's seen. And is just, although they did add Jaxon Smith-Njigba, so that's partially why. But the evidence here is showing that he is declining as a wide receiver. So the point of saying all this is that, at least in my opinion, it looks as though he's going to be declining to the point where they're probably going to want Jaxon Smith-Njigba to take over a reasonably decent amount of his target share. And he already had 93 this past season. I would not be surprised if they flipped targets, and they generally should be passing more in this offense anyways. So there's really room for them and DK Metcalf as well. So I mentioned earlier that Matt Harmon helped explain kind of what we were seeing in terms of his progression as a route runner. So per Matt Harmon, JSN's route running is quite good, especially in the back half of the season. And the total stats, in the sense of counting stats of catches, receptions, and touchdowns, are fake news. And I completely agree. When he looked at his film, he also, as it's important to know, contextualized the fact that this guy has a cast on his hand. That makes it a little bit challenging to catch footballs when you have a broken wrist. And besides that, they were using him in the short area of the field exclusively. He's great in the short area of the field, but you want to get him involved on different routes. You want to get him involved downfield. He can win deep. Essentially, they were just trying to get him passes right around the line of scrimmage and then just try to make him create everything himself after the catch, which he's great after the catch, but if defenses already know what he's going to be doing, it really limits his effectiveness. Now, despite their terrible deployment of him, especially in the early part of this past season, look at some of these advanced metrics. His 2.32 yards of target separation were good for 6th in the entire NFL. Now, to contextualize that, some of that is when you're running shorter routes, it's easier to get quick separation. But if you're not very good, you also don't get the 6th best target separation in the entire NFL either. So that just goes to show that he is very quick in and out of his routes. He's a very solid route runner, and he is intelligent too. It shows that he knows how to work defenses and where the holes in zone coverage are going to be. Now, we know that he's good at reading zone coverage and being able to find the holes in it. Looking at his man success rate, it was 41.2%, which was good for 26th in the NFL. That's pretty solid, especially for a rookie. And he also had a 59.6 success rate versus zone. And then when you look at his total route win rate of 52.7%, that was actually 17th in the entire NFL. 17th. So while his end-of-season numbers weren't astronomical, his advanced stats tell you that he is a very good player who just needed more opportunity. So, remember how I said earlier that while he was primarily used in the short area of the field and specifically the slot, he's also capable of winning on the outside? Well, he did something that has never happened in NFL history, at least modern NFL recorded history. He became the first rookie to have 2 last-minute game-winning touchdowns in a season. So what does that tell us? That tells us that despite their frustrating lack of usage with him, when it counted and when it mattered most, who did they go to? They went to JSN, and he delivered both times. With just 28 seconds remaining against the Eagles, JSN lined up on the outside and caught a deep ball from Drew Lock, so he had to make an over-the-shoulder catch, and he had to crumple his body down and find a way to get on the ground and turn away from the defenders so that they couldn't get the ball away from him, and it was really impressive. And it really went to show that, hey, I can win on the outside, guys. Like, why aren't you using me here? Then when we look at his other game-winning touchdown, it was against the Browns. They had him in the slot, and then they ran a bubble screen, and DK Metcalf came in and plowed the defender and managed to not get a holding call. Props to him. He held it perfectly. And JSN beat his defender with kind of a little stutter into the end zone on the left side of the field. So once again, when it mattered most, who did they go to? They went to JSN as a rookie. And what did he do? Both times he delivered in the clutch. When we look at the Seattle Seahawks depth chart, it's relatively the same, at least as far as the quarterback situation and skill positions go. They still have Geno Smith, who isn't going to really create anything on his own, but he is a 33-year-old vet. He can run an effective offense if the scheme is actually effective. By the way, if you've seen the interview that JSN had a couple months ago, they asked him what he thought about his rookie season, specifically Shane Waldron. He basically said, good luck to Chicago. So if that tells you anything about how he personally feels about his deployment this past season. But anyways, so they have Geno Smith. He's fine. He'll be able to conduct a new offense here. He'll keep things rolling. He doesn't really create. He just sticks to the plan. Then they still have Kenneth Walker at running back. He is one of the better runners of the football in the NFL. He's an adequate pass catcher, nothing special. Then they drafted second-round running back Zach Charbonnet this past season. He didn't really get that much usage besides when Kenneth Walker was injured. He was used sparingly here and there, but they have 2 effective running backs. So what that means is they should be able to have a consistent running game, which will therefore help balance the passing attack and make it harder for defenses to stack the box or really just double cover any of these wide receivers. Then they still have prototypical X wide receiver DK Metcalf. He's just going to be their X wide receiver. He doesn't really have that much positional versatility. He can play Z or slot, but he's best used as their X. And the other wide receivers are better used not as an X, so it just works itself out in that way. And they still have Tyler Lockett. He is much better as a Z or Y wide receiver than an X. So they complement each other as well as JSN in that way. I think that JSN and Tyler Lockett are generally going to split reps at Z and Y to help keep things mixed up. Oh, another thing about this new offense is they're going to cluster their receivers more and not have them so widely spread. This will help them beat man coverage. It'll help make things confusing for defenders, and their assignments are going to be much more challenging than they used to be with it more spread out. Because remember, they were using a lot of 12 personnel, so they had two wide receivers, one on each side, two tight ends on either side of the line to help the tackles. That made it much easier for defenses to scheme against them, and therefore it made their offense mid. And they still have Noah Fant at tight end. He's an effective pass catcher. He's a solid playmaker. Overall, their skill position players are among the best in terms of a total group in the NFL, really. No top tier superstars per se, but a bunch of very good players. And I think in this new offense, they're really going to complement each other. So I've made mention here and there in the video that Shane Waldron was very ineffective as an offensive coordinator. He's very rigid. He doesn't like to mold his scheme to help fit the skills of his players. He wanted the players to fit his scheme. That's just, unfortunately for him, not how that works. They did have tackle troubles with injuries, so that's partially why they did a lot more 12 personnel, but he was not very creative, very vanilla offense, very run-heavy. Just not going to get it done in today's NFL. Well, out with the old, in with the new. They brought in former Washington OC Ryan Grub. This guy is the complete opposite. He loves 11 personnel, and he's very creative. When we look at his Washington Huskies team from this past season, Geno Smith and Michael Penix reasonably compare as quarterbacks. Penix has a stronger arm than Geno Smith, but their general lack of mobility, they can be mobile if they have to, but their kind of gunslinger approach is relatively the same. Then when we look at what he did this past season, and that being Ryan Grubb, he had Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, and Rome Odunze, three talented wide receivers. So what did he do? Did he force them to conform to 12 personnel and not use them to their strengths, or did he use the strengths of his roster to his advantage and have an explosive offense? Well, he did the latter. So what I think we can conclude from that is that he's going to think, well, we have JSN, we have Tyler Lockett, we have DK Metcalf. Let's be creative. Let's get them all three on the field, and let's see what we can get out of them. So in the article I have here, it says, Seahawks choose upside over experience, hiring Ryan Grubb as offensive coordinator. The article begins, rather than hand the keys to their offense to an also-ran, the Seattle Seahawks decided to swing for the fences, hiring Ryan Grubb as their offensive coordinator, despite the fact he has never coached in the NFL before. The article continues, beyond formations, Grubb effectively incorporates a ton of pre-snap motion to create conflict for opposing defenses in the pass and run game. He has shown himself to be a master at deploying screens, using them to effectively neutralize opposing pass rushes, and set up shot plays downfield, which Washington did as well as any team over the past 2 years, racking up explosive passes in bunches. When we think about this, DK Metcalf is going to be the Rome Odunze of this offense. He's going to be used more so downfield, but he's not going to be exclusively used on curl routes and streaks, at least in this offense. Then Lockett and JSN are going to be Jalen McMillan and Jalen Polk, who could both be used interchangeably in the Z and Y position. So one reason to be optimistic this year is he's had similar profiles and talents in the past, although I think his receiver core in Seattle is more talented than his receiving core in Washington, even though I think Rome Odunze is the most talented of any of these receivers. But based on the fact that he's been able to do this in the past, I do believe that's reason for us to believe in him now and in the future. But the article continues, leaning on his extensive background coaching in the trenches, Grubb's offensive lines have consistently been among the nation's best, including the Huskies' finish with the second fewest sacks given up in 2022. This has played a vital role in his offense as being dominant, moving the chains on third down, including leading the country in conversion rate, which was 57% last season. So Seattle has a fine offensive line. It's not among the league's best or anything. It would have been. Let me rephrase. It would have been fine if they didn't have injuries with both of their tackles throughout the entire year, really. And we can't predict injuries. So assuming his offensive line doesn't deal with injuries the entire season once again, we can look at what Michael Penix did. He actually led the nation in lowest sack rate. And I think that's going to carry over in this offense for Geno Smith. They're going to ask him to get the ball out in time. They're going to use screens. They're going to use condensed formations. They're going to use motion. This is going to be a much more modernized NFL offense and isn't going to be as stale as this past season. So as I have on the screen here, I think they're going to be running a lot of 11 personnel. Now this is just the base 11 personnel where you have your X on the left, Z on the right, and Y in the slot. There's obviously different formations of the 11 personnel. I think that JSN is generally going to be asked to be a Y or a Z, which are once again going to give him free releases off the line of scrimmage. This is going to allow him to use his agility to his advantage, his precise route running, and very good hands. And I do think he's also going to be used more vertically than he was this past season. I mean, even with Shane Waldron in the second half of the season, even as Matt Harmon said, they did start to use him more downfield, and that game-winning touchdown against the Eagles showed that, hey, he can do it. But I don't think we're going to start out slow like we did this past season. When we look at where he's going in redraft and dynasty, in redraft he's being drafted as the wide receiver 46. I think that's a little bit low. I think DK Metcalf is going to be right around wide receiver 20, and I'd suspect Tyler Lockett and JSN are both going to be in the 30s as wide receivers this season. So I think that is a little bit of a value. His ceiling is really limited because of there being two other wide receivers in this offense. But this isn't going to be a very run-heavy offense, and it's going to be more creative. So we can expect a much better pace of play, first of all. But then we can expect just better plays being called. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more vertical routes out of JSN, thus increasing his yardage, even if it decreases his catch percentage. So once again, I think it's actually a little bit of a value. It's just his ceiling is limited unless there's injuries to the other players. But in Dynasty, being drafted as the wide receiver 31, I do think that's a value. This guy is very, very talented. I mean, after somebody goes into a crowded wide receiver room with a terrible play caller, and they don't put up Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua numbers, they think, oh, this guy's terrible. He's very good. This is Dynasty. Sure, his name value isn't quite what it was when he was drafted this past season, but it's important to contextualize things. That's why, and while to a degree because people don't contextualize things, it lowers his market value, you can take advantage of that. Tyler Lockett is on a one-year deal. That guy is gone after this season, especially if he continues to decline. I mean, you saw those stats. He massively declined from 2022 to 2023, and he's only on a one-year deal. He is almost certainly gone after this season, and at that point, JSN is going to clearly be the wide receiver 2, if he's not this year even. I think personally, let me just say this. I think this season he is going to be the wide receiver 2. And in this new offense, I think that his max upside with no injuries is reasonably a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. But I think at worst he's going to be a low-end wide receiver 3. But as soon as next season, he could absolutely be a mid to high-end wide receiver 2. This guy is dangerous with the ball in his hands. He's one of the better yards after catch guys despite his lack of top-end speed. His agility well makes up for that. Remember, it's 99th percentile. I think you're getting a value here, so get him at wide receiver 31, and once Tyler Lockett leaves, enjoy the results. So there you have it. I do believe in JSN. I think when you contextualize his rookie year, it was actually quite impressive. He wasn't used correctly. Shane Waldron's old-style, run-heavy, rigid approach was not good for him, but Ryan Grubb's more pass-heavy, flexible, condensed, creative approach is going to massively help him. I think Tyler Lockett is declining and JSN is ascending. Really, I think JSN is set for a wide receiver 3 season this year and much higher than that in the future as soon as Tyler Lockett leaves town. But what do you think? Are you a believer in JSN? Do you not believe in JSN? How do you think he'll finish the season? Let me know in the comment section below and let me know why. With that being said, I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist, your NFL breaking news source, and the dynasty and redraft implications behind said breaking news. I am building a library of information with which you can use to dominate your redraft and dynasty leagues in 2024 and beyond. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.